Edward VIII was crowned King of the United Kingdom on the 20th of January 1936, accompanied by the usual pomp and circumstance. While royalists across the British Empire were filled with hope and a sense of renewal, Edward's reign would end just 326 days later, when he chose to abdicate and marry the divorced American socialite Wallis Simpson. That melodrama is a story all on its own, yet historically more interesting is what happened next. A series of events which prompted persistent rumors that Edward was not only a Nazi sympathizer, but was prepared to betray the nation he had once ruled. In the 1930s, approval of Hitler was not uncommon, particularly amongst British elites. The Nazis were seen as a necessary, if crude, bulwark against communism in Soviet Russia. Hitler was also an ardent admirer of the British. Most of those same sympathizers would ultimately be horrified at the colossal crimes that the Nazis would commit, but at the time, few realized the danger. Though princes and monarchs never made public utterances on politics, high society was well aware that in the pre-war period, Edward was a Nazi sympathizer. He also believed in racial superiority. After a 1920 visit to Australia, he wrote of Australian Aboriginals. "They are the most revolting form of living creatures I have ever seen, the lowest form of human beings, and the nearest thing to monkeys." After the abdication, his successor and brother, George VI, named him Edward, Duke of Windsor. Edward married Simpson in France on the 3rd of June 1937. All British royalty were barred from attending, and Wallis Simpson was not allowed to be known as the Duchess of Windsor, moves which Edward bitterly resented. He had also believed that after a year or two of exile in France, he and his wife would be permitted to return to England. The new king made clear that this would not happen. Edward was furious, believing that the establishment had betrayed him. In October 1937, as though in an act of revenge, Edward and his wife visited Nazi Germany and were received by Hitler at the Berghof. The British government were mortified, particularly when the Duke gave Nazi salutes. The Nazis, masters of propaganda, received them as genuine royalty on a state visit and scored a major public relations coup. Albert Speer quoted Hitler as saying that if Edward had remained king, then a military alliance between Britain and Germany would have been assured. It was rumoured that Hitler and Edward discussed scenarios under which he could return to the throne. This has never been substantiated. In a May 1939 interview on NBC Radio, Edward appeared to endorse further appeasement just a few months before war was declared. The BBC, likely under pressure from the government, refused to broadcast it, though it was reported in newspapers. As the so-called phony war of 1939 ended and hostilities loomed in early 1940, Edward was appointed a Major General attached to the British military mission in France. At this point, serious allegations of treachery against the Duke began to emerge. In February 1940, the German ambassador to The Hague, Julius von Sack-Burgers-Rode, claimed that Edward had leaked British war plans to Germany. The claim was denied, though the British government took it seriously. As king, before the war, Edward had a cavalier attitude toward secret documents sent to him by the cabinet. Simpson had been reading them, as had other visitors to the royal household, and they were often left unsecured. This was irresponsible, especially since American intelligence sources believed that Simpson was a close friend of the German foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and was even more favourable towards Hitler than the Duke. Consequently, Edward had long been regarded as a security risk by the British, whether unwittingly or wittingly. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider subscribing. Thank you. As France fell, the couple began an odd series of moves that aroused further suspicion. Instead of returning to England, they first went to Biarritz, then fascist Spain, before finally settling in neutral Portugal, at the home of a shady character named Ricardo Espirito Santo, who had inherited a banking fortune and retained contacts with various intelligence agencies, including both the Germans and the British. There followed a bizarre Nazi plan, Operation Willy, to persuade Edward to return to occupied Europe and work with the Nazis on securing an accommodation with Britain. Orders were given to kidnap him if necessary. Winston Churchill became aware of the plot and demanded Edward return to England or face a court-martial. In the event, Churchill solved the situation by appointing the Duke governor of the Bahamas. The couple left Lisbon on the 1st of August. Though out of the way, Edward continued to make occasional embarrassing statements, either about accommodation with Germany or about the people he governed. Further embarrassment ensued when it emerged that Edward had asked the Nazis to guard his French property during the occupation, a request with which they complied. Following the war, the Duke returned to France and lived the remainder of his life out of the public eye. As declassified documents emerged, mainly after his death, speculation mounted about his political sympathies and potentially treacherous behavior. So did he betray his country? No paper trail or intercepted broadcast ever implicated him, though such a high-level spy would likely be outside the regular intelligence loop. Some of the statements implicating him may have been an attempt by the Nazis to lower morale in Britain. Yet there is no doubt that he was pro-Nazi before the war, and he expressed, in the presence of others, his admiration for Hitler. The British and American governments were both very suspicious of the Duke and his wife, both before the war and during it. Until solid evidence emerges from archives, like all of us, he remains innocent until proven guilty, but his own pronouncements and behavior did nothing to allay suspicion, and ensures that his reputation will be forever clouded by the allegation that he treacherously assisted one of the most evil regimes of all time. Eliot Ness, the man who brought down Al Capone, is as famous as any detective in modern American history. Immortalized in film and television, he is rightly revered for his genuinely impressive success in the field of crime fighting. But just like in the old saying that all political careers end in failure, Ness's legendary time in law enforcement would end without a crowning glory. His last major case pitted his wits against those of one of the most grisly serial killers of all time, a psychopath who became known as the Cleveland Torso Murderer. The killer's 12 known victims were murdered between 1935 and 1938, although some estimates claim that the final tally could be as high as 20. Of the 12, only 3 were ever positively identified. Unusually for a serial killer, both men and women were killed. Depression-era America was filled with drifters and indigents, and they were an easy target for exploitation or murder. In Cleveland, huge shantytowns sprang up, populated not only by the down and out, but by so-called working poor, whose employment income was so inadequate that they were forced into slums alongside the penniless. The shantytown, known as Cleveland Flats, was the killer's hunting ground. One area in particular, known as Kingsbury Run, was at the epicenter of the murders. This gave rise to the killer's nickname, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Victims were gratuitously dismembered and often found long after death. These factors made an already challenging case seem close to hopeless. To begin with, Ness had only a peripheral involvement in the matter. He occupied the role of Director of Public Safety with responsibility for the police, but did no day-to-day investigation. As law enforcement reached an impasse in the inquiry, pressure grew for him to take a more hands-on role. Ness himself was aiming for a political career and needed little encouragement to insert himself into the manhunt. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider subscribing. Thank you. And initially, he did add something to the investigation. He developed a suspect, Dr. Francis Sweeney, who had initially been discounted by the police. In what would now be known as criminal profiling, Ness saw in Sweeney all the ingredients required. A violent drunk with mental problems, Sweeney had also been a military surgeon during World War I, specializing in amputations. Body parts had been found near a soldier's home that Sweeney frequented. Ness also believed that Sweeney had been prematurely excluded because he came from a prominent family, and his cousin was a congressman who had frequently criticized Ness for his failure to make an arrest in the case. The doctor was brought in and thoroughly interrogated, a process which included 2 of the first ever polygraph tests. All who took part in the interviews were convinced of Sweeney's guilt, but without a confession, Sweeney walked. A frustrated and impatient Ness then made a rare error that would not only end his investigation, but damage him for the remainder of his life. He ordered that the shanty towns be evacuated and burned, a misguided attempt to stop the killings. The population of Cleveland interpreted this as a callous act, depriving already destitute people of their only shelter. Ironically, after his pressuring of Sweeney, the doctor checked himself into a mental hospital and the killing stopped. It seemed that perhaps Ness had been right all along. For years afterwards, Sweeney sent taunting and threatening letters and postcards to Ness and his family until his death in an institution in 1964. Ness never wavered that he had found the killer. Others believed that the killer simply moved on from Cleveland and killed again elsewhere in the U.S. The reputation and life of Eliot Ness went into a downward spiral after the unsuccessful hunt for the torso murderer. Already a heavy drinker, his consumption slid out of control and included a drunk driving accident which he was accused of attempting to cover up. Despite his reduced standing, he decided to run an ultimately disastrous campaign for mayor of Cleveland. From there, he faded into obscurity, and the man who had ridden high as the leader of the Untouchables in Prohibition-era Chicago was reduced to working as a bookstore clerk, among many other odd jobs. Although he was flawed, he remained honest in a time where dishonesty paid. Later generations would celebrate his remarkable career, but in 1957, Eliot Ness died of a massive heart attack, penniless and almost forgotten. The Second World War is an endless source of fascinating and almost unbelievable true stories. One such tale revolves around 2 unlikely allies, the Nazis and the IRA, or Irish Republican Army, who have fought campaigns for a united Ireland and an end to British involvement in that troubled part of the world. The story proved the maxim that my enemy's enemy is my friend. Between the wars, the Republic of Ireland, or Irish Free State as it was then known, had gained close to full independence from the British Empire. As hostilities began, the government of Eamon de Valera faced a sobering dilemma. By declaring war on the seemingly ascendant Nazis, they would be a prime target for a backdoor invasion of the UK. By remaining neutral, they risked reoccupation by the British. De Valera chose the course of neutrality. This course, when combined with the infamous telegram of condolences on the death of Hitler, would ultimately damage the Free State's reputation, although it seemed the safest option at the time. For the IRA, there was a different calculus. They still regarded the treaty end of the Irish War of Independence, which divided the island into two separate countries and resulted in the Irish Civil War between pro- and anti-treaty forces, as a betrayal of nationalist ideals. They had lost the Civil War, and having been banned by the Free State government in 1935, were effectively on the run. But in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity, and as war approached, a new IRA Army Council, under the leadership of Sean Russell, made a decision to forge links with the Nazis. To that point, the IRA had been unmistakably socialist. IRA men raised a column to fight for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, although the organization's rightward move led to a ban on the so-called Connolly column. With the socialist wing of the IRA either dead or in jail, Russell charted a militarist course, determined to confront Britain in Northern Ireland. Social policy of the organization became more Catholic and corporatist inspired, moving more in the direction of Mussolini than Marx. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider subscribing. Thank you. In January 1939, the IRA Army Council officially declared war on Britain. S-Plan, as it was called, started a campaign of sabotage bombings on the British mainland. On the 23rd of December 1939, IRA members stole almost the entire reserve ammunition store of the Irish Army from the magazine fort in Dublin. Much of it later turned up in Northern Ireland, discovered by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, presumably stashed in preparation for an attack on the north. These actions impressed the Nazis, and they dispatched an Abwehr agent, Oscar C. Faust, to, quote, seek out the IRA leadership, make contact, ask if they would be interested in cooperation with Germany, and if so, send a liaison man to Germany. Sean O'Donovan, a German-speaking and high-ranking member of the IRA, was dispatched to Germany. After a series of meetings, logistics for cooperation, such as communication, safe houses, and supply of weapons, were established. From here, though, things began to go pear-shaped. The IRA had too weak a radio transmitter to contact the Nazis reliably. Then disaster struck. Russell travelled to Germany in 1940 to request arms, but on the return journey in a German U-boat, he was taken ill and died. His successor, Stephen Hayes, floated Plan Kathleen, an invasion of Northern Ireland, to the Nazis, only for it to be immediately discovered by Irish intelligence. Günter Schütz, an Abwehr agent sent to supervise operations, was arrested as soon as he parachuted into Ireland. He eventually escaped, but when a courier was caught with minutes of an Army Council meeting, Schütz and all proposed operations were completely compromised again. A prized Belfast unit of the IRA, the so-called Protestant Squad, were talked into an ill-advised gun battle with the RUC, resulting in the complete capture of the unit, one of whom was executed. All other operations were either stillborn or turned out to be complete fiascos. The whole episode was a disaster for the IRA. Many members were executed. What little public support they had waned further. As the true horror of the Nazis became evident, the organization would be forever stained by the association. Humiliated and bitterly divided, the IRA called a ceasefire in its war against Britain on the 10th of March, 1945. So ineffective had their campaign been, that the world reacted with bemusement to the end of a war that they didn't even know had existed. This is a follow-up to the video entitled Jack the Ripper, the Forgotten Suspect, which profiled Charles Allen Lechmere, who was caught in flagrante at the freshly killed body of Polly Nichols. If you haven't yet seen this video, it's linked in the description below. While Lechmere is certainly an excellent suspect, there are many others. In this video, we will round up the usual and unusual suspects. Our roundup begins at the most unlikely and fantastic end of the spectrum, with a theory that became fashionable in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in film and television, that implicated the British royal family, establishment, and/or Freemasons as being behind the murders. Prince Albert, Duke of Clarence. It hardly seems worth pointing out that the Prince was not Jack the Ripper, but such is the allure of the establishment conspiracy, some still entertain the theory that the murders took place to cover up illicit behaviour and illegitimate heirs. Albert was not in London when the murders were committed. His involvement is impossible. Sir William Gull. Queen Victoria's personal physician, Gull has been portrayed in film, galloping around Whitechapel in a mysterious royal coach to carry out the foul deeds. Unfortunately, Gull was in his 70s at the time of the murders and had recently had a stroke. Setting aside the fantastic theory, the killings would have been physically beyond him. J.K. Stephen. Stephen was a tutor to the aforementioned Prince Albert. His only qualification as a Ripper suspect were a series of rambling personal writings that were both misogynistic and psychopathic. He is every bit as bad a suspect as the others. Walter Sickert. The last major suspect in the establishment theory, Sickert was a celebrated and well-connected painter. In 2002, American crime writer Patricia Cornwell made a wild claim that he was Jack the Ripper, based on something she had seen in his paintings and some slipshod DNA work that supposedly linked him to one of the 600 or so Ripper letters held by Scotland Yard. The fact that Sickert was in France for at least 2 of the murders didn't deter her. Independent analysis of the DNA further rubbished her theory. The establishment, royal family, and Freemason conspiracy is now firmly in the realms of Hollywood and fiction. Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister and schoolmaster who was dismissed from his school and then committed suicide. His family had a history of mental illness. He only became a suspect because his suicide coincided with the presumed end of the murders. There is no other link, and he was known to have been in Dorset when one of the murders occurred. Michael Ostrog. Ostrog was a Russian-born conman and thief who was first mentioned in the McNaughton Papers, a compilation of tips and suspects that was produced years after the murders. He was never seriously considered by police at the time, and may well have been in prison in France when the crimes occurred. John Pizer, aka Leather Apron. Pizer has the distinction of being the only man ever officially named by the police as Jack the Ripper, before a humiliating climb down by the authorities. He had been arrested by a Sergeant William Thick, who was said to have a personal grudge against Pizer. Detectives quickly released him, when it became clear that in addition to a lack of evidence, he had solid alibis for 2 of the murders. Pizer received financial compensation from at least one newspaper who named him. Carl Feigenbaum. Feigenbaum was a German sailor who committed a murder in New York. After his execution, one of his lawyers claimed that Feigenbaum had confessed to him that he was Jack the Ripper. The lawyer's partner denied that Feigenbaum had ever even mentioned the killings to him. As a sailor, Feigenbaum could well have been in London when the murders occurred, but there is nothing to say that he was, and no evidence to connect him to the crimes. Dr. Neil Cream. Neil Cream was a Victorian serial killer, both in the US and the UK. His later presence in England led to speculation that he was a valid suspect. However, it emerged that he was in prison in Illinois at the time of the murders, so could not have been the killer. Frederick Bailey Deeming was another serial killer who was hanged in Melbourne for the murder of his second wife. He had also killed his wife and family in England and fled to Australia via South Africa. Rumours circulated that at his execution he had blurted out that he was Jack the Ripper. However, this is disputed, and he was almost certainly in South Africa when the crimes occurred. George Chapman. Chapman was another murderer who was on the loose in the East End at the time and has attracted suspicion. He poisoned 3 wives, but since poisoning was his MO, it seems unlikely that he would have drastically changed that MO to carry out the Ripper murders. William Henry Berry. Berry had murdered his wife, a former prostitute, in a gruesome manner very similar to the Ripper killings. He had also lived in the East End in the right time frame. He seemed like a very interesting suspect. However, while he freely admitted killing his wife, he strenuously denied any involvement in the Whitechapel murders. That doesn't mean he still isn't a decent suspect. In just a moment, we will move on with the most promising suspects, but please consider subscribing to this channel. More subscribers means more regular updates. Thank you. George Hutchinson. Hutchinson was a mysterious character who had made a statement to police that he'd encountered Mary Jane Kelly shortly before her death. He claimed that he had followed Kelly and another man to her home, observed the place for some time, and then left, intimating that he had seen the killer. It was thought that he was an attention seeker who was possibly looking to sell a story. But he placed himself at the scene of the crime, and was he trying to divert attention away from himself with his curious story? He was never properly investigated, and is an intriguing suspect. Joseph Barnett. Barnett was the ex-boyfriend of Mary Kelly. He was questioned about her murder, released, and not suspected. Yet Barnett also had a conceivable motive. For whatever reason, he was not thoroughly investigated. On the minus side, it would be unclear what motive he had to commit the other murders. David Cohen, or Nathan Kaminsky, depending on who you talk to, was a lunatic who was sent to Colney Hatch Asylum just after the final murder. Cohen was violent and had to be restrained constantly, but the evidence against him is only circumstantial and behavioural. James Kelly. Kelly had killed his wife, been deemed insane, but then escaped from Broadmoor Hospital. He was on the loose for the entirety of the Ripper timeline, though no one knows if he was in London. He fitted the psychological profile, but other than that, there is no direct evidence to link him with the crimes. Robert Mann. Historian May Troe first unveiled Whitechapel morgue attendant Robert Mann as a suspect in 2009. Mann worked at the mortuary where the victims were taken and disregarded instructions not to touch the corpses when they were brought in. He fitted both the FBI profile and the geographical profile, knew the area intimately, and was regarded when giving evidence as shifty and unreliable. As with so many suspects, he is a good fit, but without any direct evidence. James Maybrick. Maybrick shot into the Ripper consciousness in 1992, when the supposed diary of Jack the Ripper was uncovered, allegedly written by him. In the end, it was determined a forgery, but a pocket watch was also found, which was engraved with Maybrick's name, the words "I am Jack," and the initials of the victims. To date, electron microscope examinations have been unable to discount the markings as having been made later than the murders. Maybrick also travelled constantly, including to London, and his addiction to arsenic made him unstable and violent. Just because the diary was a forgery doesn't mean Maybrick isn't still a very interesting suspect. Francis Tumblety. A quack American doctor who made a fortune peddling cure-alls and snake oil, Tumblety is an intriguing suspect. A pathological hater of women, said to have collected female wombs. Tumblety can be placed in London during the crimes. He was arrested for committing a homosexual act there and fled to America. Strangely, he was then pursued to the US by a Scotland Yard detective, despite that offence not being extraditable. US papers speculated that he was a suspect in the Ripper murders, though Scotland Yard would never confirm it. He remains a very intriguing suspect. Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish Jew, admitted to Colney Hatch Asylum in 1891. He was strongly suspected by the police to the point that he was watched and followed. Assistant Commissioner of the Met Police, Sir Robert Anderson, later wrote that Kosminski had been identified by a witness as the Ripper, but the man refused to testify against him as he was a fellow Jew. Whilst the police have suspected plenty of innocent men in their time, the attention given to him surely counts for something. He is one of the best suspects. So what do I think? I've been convinced by so many suspects and theories over the years, only to be disappointed. But now my thinking has evolved. I believe that Charles Allen Lechmere killed Polly Nichols. I have no idea if he killed the other victims, which makes me seriously consider that there may have been more than one person killing women in Whitechapel. There must be doubt that only one man was responsible. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to consider subscribing.